Hi, everyone. This week, we're going to focus on American involvement, direct involvement in the Second World War once we're drawn into the conflict beginning in December 1941. In today's lecture, we're going to focus on the war in Europe, and next lecture will be on the war in Asia and the Pacific. Now, by way of review, let's take a look at the map you see in front of you. The war in Europe is over 2 years old by the time the United States becomes involved. It starts in September of 1939 when Germany, here, invades Poland, here. Remember when we talked about the run-up to the war last week, we said that they're building tensions in Europe. Germany invades Poland, Great Britain and France declare war on Germany, and the war in Europe has begun. After conquering Poland, and don't worry too much about this, but just put this in the back of your mind, the Germans actually divide Poland between themselves and the Soviet Union. Germany and the Soviet Union have for nearly 2 years a non-aggression agreement in place where they agree not to fight each other, and they actually divide up parts of Eastern Europe. After conquering Poland, I wouldn't worry too much about it for our purposes. The Germans make some small conquests, including Denmark, their neighbor to the north, and Norway. And then remember what we talked about, the big thing that spurred on American rearmament, but also I think led isolationists to form America First, the German conquest of France. That conquest is May and June of 1940, a major German victory, very significant. The Germans, however, failed to conquer Great Britain during the summer and autumn of 1940. So basically, at the end of 1940, Germany and its ally Italy are pretty much the master of Europe, excluding the Soviet Union. Remember, Soviet Union and Germany have this agreement in place not to fight each other. Well, Germany breaks that agreement in June of 1941, invades the Soviet Union, and you see here their advance basically up to Pearl Harbor. It doesn't look like a lot, but the Germans have surrounded the old Russian capital of Leningrad. They've reached the outskirts of Moscow. They've overrun most of the Ukraine, the industrial and agricultural heartland of the Soviet Union. So by the time the United States enters the war in Europe, the Germans are not completely successful, but certainly they have the upper hand. Their drive in the Soviet Union is slowing down a bit because it's December and winter setting in, and they've not been able to conquer Great Britain, but otherwise they've won a pretty impressive string of victories. Now, let's consider Allied advantages as of December 1941, when the United States enters the war. I would say that once the US enters the war, Germany and its destruction is a certainty. I think maybe the best professor I ever had as an undergraduate was a man named Kenneth Jackson. He was a visiting professor at UCLA, and as a visiting professor, he got the worst time slots. I think my second and last 8 o'clock class in college was with him. I had another like 2 to 5 Friday afternoon class with him. I mean, he got the worst time slots, but he was amazing. So I always took him every quarter. Ken Jackson, I remember saying that World War II was won in a single day in December 1941, when the US enters the war and when the Germans are stopped at the Battle of Moscow. So let me just sort of build on Professor Ken Jackson's analysis. So why is the war won? The Soviet Union stays in the war, and Soviet manpower is, I think, 1/2 of the victory over Germany. Take a look at this map. Soviet Union is a massive country. Here's Germany in green, relatively small country. The pictures you see here give you some idea of Soviet mobilization. The Soviet Union mobilizes everyone they can for war, including women, who you see here, highly decorated women. These are snipers. These are Soviet soldiers, Red Army soldiers, who take part in the Battle of Moscow in December 41. You see the weather is horrible. These soldiers had been based here in Siberia, guarding against the Japanese. And the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, has these men transferred to Moscow. Moscow weather is horrible in December. Siberian weather is unspeakably bad. So for these soldiers fighting in Moscow in December 1941 is sort of like going to the beach. It's not, they're used to much more extreme temperatures. So Soviet manpower advantages are huge. You might just want to write this down. From December 1941, when the US enters the war, until May 1945, when Germany surrenders, the majority, so 50% plus of the German army is tied down on the Eastern Front. So most of the German army, the entire time we're in the war, is fighting on the Russian front. Secondly, most of, and this makes sense, most German deaths in the war are on the Eastern Front. So the Soviet Union ties down more German troops and kills more German troops than we do. This might be a little startling. The Russians actually kill more Germans than the Americans, the British, and the French combined. So Soviet manpower, really important. I would say, however, as important as Soviet manpower is American industry. If you look at war production, Germany has some small but significant advantages. The Germans produce the best jet aircraft of the war, but they deployed these aircraft late. It's the first really operational jet aircraft, but it's late in the war in limited numbers. They also have the best long-range rockets, the German V1 and V2 rocket, best rockets in the war. Just sort of an aside, after the war, we scour Germany looking for their best atomic scientists and rocket scientists. And we get one of the better ones, a man named Wernher von Braun, who's brought back to the US and helps us develop our actually space program. That's how good the German rockets are. So the Germans have good jet aircraft, best long-range rockets. The V1 and V2 rockets, just to go back to our map, are deployed here in Western Europe and can strike targets in Great Britain. So these are long-range rockets. The Germans also have, and this is pretty significant, the very best tanks of any country in World War II, better than British, American, Japanese, Soviet tanks. The US, I think, produces one really important weapon in the European theater that's better than anything the Germans have. We produce a really good long-range 4-engine bomber, and you see here its picture of the B-17. German rockets are technologically superior to the B-17, but what happens when a V2 strikes its target? It explodes. There's one explosion. When a B-17 flies over its target, it drops dozens of bombs. There are dozens of explosions. B-17, I think, in terms of a war-winning weapon, much more important than the German V1 and V2 rockets, and we can produce and do produce thousands of these bombers. Now, quality of weapons, I think you can say maybe it's a draw. Where the Allies have the advantage, and I would write this down as the single greatest American contribution to the Allied victory in Europe, is the amount of industrial production the United States is capable of. Take a look at this chart, and you might refer to it later on. You can go back to it. Here's 1941. The US economy produces over $1 trillion in goods and services a year. So when we enter the war, our economy is basically 2.5 times the economy of Germany. Our lead over Germany grows as the war progresses. 1944, our economy produces about $1.5 trillion in goods and services. So our economy goes up by nearly 50%, the German economy less than 10% during the war. Put another way, in 1941, when we enter the war, our economy is just over $1 trillion. The combined Axis economies of Germany, Italy, Japan, plus Austria, who joins Germany in 38, and France, who's overrun by Germany in 40, if you throw everybody in, they're under $1 trillion. The United States can bury the Axis in industrial products, in war machines, and we produce enough to arm our allies. Take a look at your outline. I have some numbers. We produce 300,000 warplanes, 100,000 tanks, 1,200 warships, and I would circle 3,500 landing craft. While often overlooked, I think our production of landing craft is incredibly important, especially as we get to 1944. In 1944, the United States is going to invade German-occupied France in June in 2 places. During that same time, we're also going to be preparing to land in the Central Pacific against the Japanese and the Southern Pacific against the Japanese. So we're going to be fighting in multiple places in 2 different parts of the world. And I think these are seaborne invasions. And I think our production of landing craft makes that possible. Not only do we produce for ourselves, but remember Lend-Lease. You've seen this chart before. This is just March to June of 44. Great Britain, almost $10 billion. The USSR, close to $6 billion. During the war, the United States will deliver Lend-Lease supplies of $30 billion. And remember, by the time the last Lend-Lease delivery is made, we've sent $50 billion in aid to the British first, the Soviets second. The French will become number 3, primarily in very late in the war. China is going to be number 4. We produce enough for ourselves and our allies. And I should mention, as our, in terms of our allies, the USSR and Great Britain, when we enter the war, are pretty near German war production. Or put another way, if you put the UK and the USSR together in 1941, they produce more than Germany and Italy combined. So our allies are not insignificant producers of war material. Let's now consider one final advantage that I think we sometimes forget, maybe living in the 21st century. But in 1941, the United States is the #1 producer of petroleum. This means that what the United States needs in terms of petroleum, it has plenty of. And because Great Britain and the United States dominate the world's oceans, we're the #1 and #2 naval powers in the world, we can get overseas sources of oil if we need them as well. Germans and the Italians are going to be chronically short of oil during this war. Let's now take these general advantages that we've talked about, Soviet manpower, American industry, and see some campaigns and battles where these advantages explain Allied victory. First place we want to look at is the Battle of the Atlantic during 1941 and 1943. Here's the war zone, the Atlantic Ocean. Remember that Great Britain is a great empire. Remember, Great Britain is the #1 recipient of Lend-Lease aid. So you have stuff coming into Great Britain from Canada, from the United States, from South Africa, which would be here, India here, Australia, New Zealand down here. It's all coming through the Atlantic Ocean to Great Britain. And what do the Germans do? Germany is not the naval power that Great Britain is, but it is a great submarine power. And the Germans attempt, as they did in World War I, to blockade Great Britain. The German blockade is incredibly successful during all of 1942 and the early months of 1943. At the start of 1943, the Germans are actually sinking merchant ships, carrying men and supplies to Great Britain faster than these merchant ships can be replaced. So they're not only sending supplies and soldiers and sailors down to the bottom of the Atlantic, they're actually sinking ships faster than they can be replaced. That's the beginning of 1943. 6 months later, summer 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic is won. It's over. The German submarine fleet has been withdrawn from the Atlantic. It can operate only now in the Mediterranean and here in the Baltic Sea. What changes the course of the war? These weapons that you see here. The United States ramps up production and deployment of this plane you see here. It's a bomber called the VLR B-24. VLR stands for Very Long Range. We ramp up production of these bombers and we redeploy them from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Pacific Ocean, much bigger. So we had deployed the VLR B-24 to the Pacific Ocean. We send it instead to the Atlantic, where we don't arm it with bombs. Instead, we put them in Great Britain, in Iceland, in Canada, in the Bahamas, down here in South America. And what do? They fly around the Atlantic Ocean day and night. We repurposed the VLR B-24 into a reconnaissance plane. And it hunts for German submarines because during 42 and 43, submarines, the German submarines, have to surface at least once a day to bring in air. German commanders also like to travel on the surface whenever possible because it expends less fuel than traveling underwater. Just imagine when you swim, it's harder to swim underwater than on top of the water, same for a submarine. So German submarines, either traveling on the surface or surfacing to get air, can be spotted by these VLR B-24s. What happens next? They can be attacked by destroyers. Remember September 1940? We deployed 50 old destroyers to Great Britain to help them combat German submarines. Destroyers are warships specifically designed to hunt down and destroy submarines. Well, remember, by early 1943, we've been building up our Navy. Remember the July 1940 Two-Ocean Navy Act for 2.5 years. So we are able to flood the Atlantic Ocean with destroyers. The other thing we flood the Atlantic with are things called escort carriers, and you see them here. These are small escort carriers, or small carriers. A big carrier, which we'll talk about in our next lecture, the Essex class carrier, might carry 100 warplanes. An escort carrier might carry a dozen. But what they do is they travel, these small aircraft carriers, with the merchant ship convoys. And when a VLR B-24 spots a German submarine, these airplanes take off, and you see here they have bombs. They attack and destroy the submarine. By the spring of 1943, We are now sinking German submarines faster than the Germans can replace them. And in July, the German Navy makes the decision, withdraw the submarines from here to here or here, where the LRB-24s and escort carriers, can't hunt down and destroy our submarines. The bravery of American, British, Canadian, sailors from dozens of different countries, you can't overstate rather their bravery and their skill. But in the end, I think it's American industrial production flooding the Atlantic with escort carriers, destroyers, VLR-B-24s, which win the battle. And why is victory so important? The United States is going to have to lead an invasion of German-occupied Western Europe. We can't do that until we build up our forces in Great Britain. And we can't really build up our forces in Great Britain until we've won the Battle of the Atlantic, which we do essentially a year before we invade German-occupied Europe. So the Battle of the Atlantic, which is won by the middle of 1943, will will be part of the reason why we are able to invade German-occupied Western Europe in June of 1944. The other thing that's going to help us invade German-occupied Europe is an unexpected victory in the air war against Germany. The United States begins limited bombings of Germany in the summer of 1942. The real sustained bombing campaign starts in 1943. And the bombing campaign, I think, is made possible by the mass production. Remember, we produced 300,000 warplanes. Two warplanes that we produce that are really important for the bombing of Germany and German-occupied Europe is this plane, which you're familiar with, the B-17. Its nickname is the Flying Fortress, which gives you some appreciation for its durability and its ability to defend itself. The other really important weapon in the air campaign against Germany is this plane. This is the P-51. You can make an argument that it's the best fighter in Europe. I'm not sure that it is, or best conventional fighter, but it's a very good fighter. And if you take a close look at it, look at what it's carrying here underneath. These aren't bombs. These are external fuel tanks. Fighters can't fly as far as bombers, but we developed these external fuel tanks. So basically the P-51s have fuel under their wings, but they also have this belly tank. And you see in some of the pictures, you can get a better view of actually twin belly tanks. What does that mean? It means that these small fighters can accompany the bombers all the way, let's say, to Berlin and back. And why is that so important? Our goal in the bombing campaign is to destroy German industry. And you sort of just take a look at this chart. We don't do it. German industrial production actually increases. So the bombing campaign doesn't destroy German industry. We hope to destroy German oil production. We don't do that. The Germans are going to be chronically short of oil, but they've been short of oil early in the war as well. We're hoping maybe to break German morale. We don't do that. We also hope to destroy the transportation networks in Belgium and France in anticipation of the Allied landings. We disrupt, but we don't destroy German transportation networks in Western Europe. So what do we do? Why is the bombing campaign for our limited look at the war so important? And let me just say, there are a lot of interesting things about the bombing campaign. Was it a proper use of resources? Was it a moral or immoral thing to do? This is a picture of a German city, Dresden, which the British and the Americans do sort of take pains to attack in a way during the war to cause a firestorm, to cause the maximum damage. British and Americans bomb during I think it's a high pressure system where the winds will be more likely to create a firestorm. The Americans bomb with high explosives to disrupt firefighting services, to create rubble, blow up water mains. British use fire bombs. So when you look at this picture of a gutted German city, there's a lot we can say, but here's what I want you to focus in on. Bombing campaign doesn't break morale, doesn't cripple fuel production, doesn't destroy German industry, doesn't break morale. What does it do? It destroys the German Air Force in Western Europe. The German Air Force in Western Europe, so in Holland, Belgium, and France, it must respond to the bombing campaign. And German Air Force, man for man, I think as good as the British or American Air Force. But German fighters are overwhelmed by the sheer number of warplanes thrown against them. And during 1943 and the first 6 months of 1944, the German fighters in Holland, Belgium, and France are overwhelmed. And circle this. By the time American, British, and Canadian forces land in German-occupied France in June 44, the German Air Force is too weak to attempt to block the invasion. The Germans can't really attack the ships in the English Channel. The Germans can't really attack the men on the beaches. And why? German planes have been shot out of the sky, 1943, and the first 6 months of 1944. So bombing campaign, along with the Battle of the Atlantic, are going to make possible, I think, the success of our landings in German-occupied France. What else helps us succeed? Our Russian allies. Remember the Soviet Red Army tying down the bulk of the German army, killing more Germans than the Americans, British, and the French combined. I want to be clear and careful about what I'm going to say here. I think in the absence of Lend-Lease aid, Soviets probably would have been able to hold their own. I am not sure that the Soviet Red Army could have pushed the Germans back, which they do. The Germans actually get all the way to Stalingrad in 1942. So I don't think the Russians could have pushed the Germans from here to here to here, all the way back to Berlin without American aid. On the Eastern Front, the US contributes to the Soviet victory by sending the Russians about 7,000 tanks. They're not as good as Russian tanks, but when we send the Russians 7,000 tanks, that allows the Russians to produce 7,000 more of their own T-34 tanks, which are better than American tanks. We send the Russians 11,000 aircraft, which by and large are as good as the best Russian aircraft. I would circle 400,000 transport vehicles. I think that's the single most important thing we send the Russians. It allows them, these 400,000 trucks basically, to do two important things. If we're sending them 400,000 trucks, they don't have to make their own. They can make more war machines, especially tanks. These trucks also really help them when they take the offensive against the Germans. And these three pictures, I think, tell us what we need to remember. Here's a Red Army tank. You see the red star. It's a Lend-Lease tank. Here's a Red Air Force plane. I think it's a P-40 maybe. Red star, it's an American Lend-Lease plane. And this is an excerpt of one of two really hauntingly beautiful Soviet war poems. The other one, which I didn't put, is called Wait for Me. It's a soldier writing to his wife. And he's explaining how he survived the war. And he says, you know, everyone stopped waiting. My friends drank toasts to my memory. My mother stopped waiting, but you didn't. You saved me. And it's a really beautiful poem. This is an excerpt from another one. It's not the whole poem, but it's written by a man to a son who dies. And just the last two lines: farewell then my son, farewell then my conscience, my youth and my solace, my one and my only. Soviet Union does get 400,000 trucks, 11,000 planes, 7,000 tanks from the Americans. But the Soviet Union probably loses 25 to 26 million people. We supply them a lot of hardware, and they supply the people. And this marriage of American industry and Soviet ability to absorb unspeakable losses ties down the bulk of the German army. If not for the Russians, when we land in German-occupied France, we would have faced many, 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 many more German soldiers. It's not on the outline, but you might as well write down this word, bagration, B-A-G-R-A-T-I-O-N. B-A-G-R-A-T-I-O-N. To prevent the Germans from redeploying soldiers from the Eastern Front to the Western Front after we land at D-Day, the Soviet Union launches on June 21st or 22nd, 1944. So about 2 weeks after the D-Day landings, the American landings in German-occupied France, Operation Bagration. It's their greatest offensive of Germany against Germany in the entire war. And it prevents the Germans from withdrawing troops to respond to the Allied landings. So, Battle of the Atlantic makes possible the buildup of American forces. The bombing campaign destroys the German Air Force in Western Europe. Our allies, the Soviet Union, tie down the German army. Before D-Day, we do engage the Germans in several other places. So turning to the Western Front, the first place we engage the Germans, interestingly enough, is in North Africa. The Germans take over the French colonies in North Africa early in the war in 1940 after France surrenders. And the Germans are trying to capture Egypt, which belongs to Britain and holds a vital waterway, the Suez Canal. Well, in November of 1942, the British launch an offensive against the Germans out of Egypt, and the Americans, who you see here, land in French West Africa. You see them streaming ashore, and we engage the Germans in French North Africa. And you see here a destroyed American tank. And I think this is a Bedouin with a camel walking by. Gives you some sense of, you know, where we're fighting. But the campaign in North Africa and the landings are codenamed Torch. So the Torch landings in 42, which you see here, are successful. The campaign in North Africa is successful. And in May of 1943, the Germans are pushed out of North Africa. What makes Operation Torch successful? I mean, this is sort of amazing to think about. Here's the United States, here's the Atlantic, here's North Africa. How is it that we can launch an invasion this distant place. I mean, this is a whole new continent. 11 months into the war, I think you have to remember early preparation. The Two-Ocean Navy Act is July 1940. We've been building up our fleet for over 2 years before the Torch landings. The peacetime draft begins September of 1940. So, the men and the ships that deposit our troops here in North Africa, we've been building up for over 2 years. After North Africa, we land in Italy, first here in Sicily, and then in the Italian mainland. Sicily falls rather quickly, but the Germans are resisting in Italy until 1945. I wouldn't worry too much about the next 15 seconds of what I'm about to say, but when the Allies land here on the Italian mainland, Italy surrenders. They drop out of the war. But look here, here's Austria. And remember what we said, Germany takes over Austria in 1938. So when Italy drops out of the war, the German army simply pours into northern Italy via Austria. So British, Americans, Canadians, free French, Poles, free Czech outfits, they're fighting here in Italy until 1945. And this is actually pretty brutal because and don't worry about this, there's actually an Italian civil war going on between Italians who support the Germans and the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, and Italians who, are supporting the Allies. So terrible, long, bloody conflict. Why is it so important for our story today? The Germans are fighting, remember, on the Eastern Front, where the Russians are tying down the bulk of the army. The Germans are waiting for an expected landing here in Western Europe, and they're also fighting here in Italy. Remember the old Schlieffen plan from World War I that said, the German plan that said Germany can't win a two-front war? Well, now the Germans are basically engaged in a three-front war. So the Italian campaign doesn't produce a quick victory. We're still fighting in Italy at the end of the war in May of 45, but it does sort of spread thin German resources, east, west, and now the center in Italy. The campaign in North Africa and Italy really is just a precursor to this campaign. The landings in German-occupied France in June of 44. So here's German-occupied France. Here's Great Britain, June of 1944. The invasion force sails from Great Britain to German-occupied France. And here is a little picture to look at. Remember those 35,000 landing craft? Here's one of them, carrying soldiers to the invasion beach. You see there are 5 invasion beaches. 2 of them are seized by the British, 1 by the Canadians, and 2 by the Americans. What you don't see, of course, here are German fighters or German bombers attacking, and remember why. They've been swept from the skies. Sword, Juno, Gold, Utah. Significant, but not massive German resistance. And remember why. The Germans really are spread thin. The Germans had hoped to fortify the invasion beaches, but take a look here, remember, at German industrial production. The Germans can't, with the size of their economy, build an army to fight in 3 places and build what they call the Atlantic Wall throughout the invasion zone. Omaha Beach is actually the most difficult of the beaches because here the Atlantic Wall is the most complete. And here's where we suffer the most casualties. But the landings on June 6, 1944 are successful. And you see on your outline, within 2 weeks, 1 million soldiers are in northern France. We follow up later in June with landings here in southern France, but the main effort here is in the north. We push inland. Paris falls in August. And as we push towards Germany, the Germans launch a final great offensive in December 1944 that we call the Battle of the Bulge. Now, before I get to the battle, let me focus on this map. The Germans know in December 44, they can't defeat the Americans and the British in open combat. They're not going to push us back into the oceans. But British and the Americans have a massive army here in northwestern Europe. That army is supplied from Great Britain, and all the supplies come through a handful of ports here along the English Channel. The German objective in the Battle of the Bulge is to reach these ports, not to destroy the British and American armies and Canadian armies and Free French armies, but to simply seize these ports. If they seize the ports, it will be very difficult to supply the Allied armies, and maybe the Germans hope through a miracle they can negotiate an end to the war. Here's why the Battle of the Bulge gets its name. Here's the German offensive. They basically create a bulge in the Allied lines. Remember, their objective is the Channel ports, the ports where supplies from Britain are unloaded. The Germans attack in December. You see here terrible weather. The weather grounds the American Air Force, so our advantage in the air is negated. The Germans attack in bad weather in places where we don't expect an attack. And so this area here has a lot of green troops, new troops just arriving in the war zone, or it has troops sort of resting from heavy combat. Here's one of the troops. As an old man, his name is Dorman Turnipseed. I mentioned Ken Jackson, my very good history professor in college. Dorman Turnipseed was my amazing American government teacher in high school. And Mr. Turnipseed fought here in the Battle of the Bulge as a very young man in 1944. The Germans are initially successful in the Battle of the Bulge, but eventually the weather breaks and the German forces are attacked relentlessly from the air. As we know, the US Army, while caught off guard, responds exceptionally well, especially General Patton's Third Army. In the end, the Germans lose the Battle of the Bulge for several, I think, reasons that are familiar by now. First, their advance slows down because their armor is running low on fuel. Secondly, their advance slows down because while they're winning the battle, German soldiers are dying, they're wounded, they're taken prisoner, they're suffering from things like frostbite. German casualties in the Battle of the Bulge exceed 80,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge are similar. By the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans have been fighting for over 5 years. They're fighting on 3 separate fronts. They can't replace those 80,000 men. We can. I think the Battle of the Bulge is the place maybe where our manpower advantage late in the war begins to sort of manifest itself. The Germans are not just running out of equipment, oil, they're also running out of people. The German offensive is beaten back late December and January, and the Allies then continue to stream into Germany during January, February, March, and April. In the end, however, it's the Soviet Red Army that gets to Berlin first. And here is a Soviet soldier hoisting the flag of the Soviet Union over the German Reichstag in May of 1945. I would say remember this picture for next week when we talk about the Cold War. So I think it's important to remember this marriage of American industry and Soviet manpower. I think, especially for a US history class, it'd be a little different if it were a world history class. I think you want to remember the Battle of the Atlantic. I think you want to remember the bombing campaign. I think you want to remember Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union. Torch is important. The Italian campaign, important, but especially for Americans, D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, very important battles and campaigns. In our next lecture, we will talk about the war in Asia and the Pacific. If you've got any questions about the campaign in Europe, just let me know.